So ever since four-wheel drivers have had winches, we've also been using pulleys such as these snatch blocks to gain mechanical advantage or simply to redirect rope. And that's the way it's been for many years, but now these snatch blocks are being supplanted by these new snatch rings, typified by this one from Saber and this one from Factor 55. I've already put a video out explaining how to choose the best snatch ring for you, and this time I'm going to be looking at an important question: efficiency. So efficiency is how much energy you lose when you are using one or more pulleys. So let's say that we've got our casualty stuck here and it's going to take a force of 2,000 kilograms to shift it. So we're going to do a double line pull. We're going to run a winch line up round the snatch block and back down to the vehicle. We're going to attach that snatch block to a winch anchor point. And again, that's going to take a force of 2,000 kilograms. Now, in a perfect world, we would have a force of 1,000 kilos on each one of these lines. However, it's not going to be perfect, reason being that there is going to be friction in the snatch block and that rope is going to form and deform as it goes around. So it's going to take energy to turn it. And it's that amount of energy which is the efficiency we're interested in. So let's say that it takes 1,000 kilograms exactly. It's not going to be the case. That would be 100%. If it takes 10,050, we could call that 95% efficient, or a 5% loss. 1,100, we could call that 90%. Now, another way to look at that is mechanical advantage. If we had 1,000 kilograms here, then that would be an exact 2-to-1 mechanical advantage. And that's actually how I explain this stuff. I pretend that there's no friction loss in it because it makes life easier. And for a conceptual understanding, that works fine. But this is reality we're talking about now. Now, if we had a 1050 force here, that would actually be a 1.9-to-1 mechanical advantage, and 1,100 would be 1.8-to-1 mechanical advantage. So that's what we talk about when we mean efficiency, which is the friction loss in the pulley. Okay, this is how I set up the test rig. So again, we've got our casualty here, winch line, and then that's our winch rope. We're going to connect it to a load cell in blue here, and then we'd take a winch extension rope and run that round the snatch block and back down to the vehicle and anchor at the top, but we put a load cell at the top there as well. Now, what this allows us to do is take a look at the total force required to move the vehicle, which is on the top load cell here, and the force required by the winch, which is this one. And you can only really do that with 2 load cells because we're not really that interested in the total force. It's more what we're interested in is the ratio between this one and that one. Now, if you do it with 1 load cell, what you could do is just, first of all, winch the car up a couple of times and then take a measurement and then put your load cell there and then take a measurement again. I found that to be less accurate. The reason is that in the real world with four-wheel driving, it's hard to get an exact measurement consistently every time you winch across a given track. You know, the winch rope might go on the drum slightly differently, or there might be a little stone in the way. There's all sorts of variables there. But if we do it this way using 2 load cells, then that variable is removed because you're simply looking at the percentage between each 2 of them. Now, another complication with rigging was this load cell here. Normally when you run a double line pull, you just take your winch rope out, round the pulley and back down to the vehicle, easy. Couldn't do that in this case because we had the load cell in the way. And the load cell is obviously not going to go around the pulley, and we don't want it to because we're actually trying to measure the force in this line. And then the complicating factor is that this is a 2-to-1 mechanical advantage. So for every metre this moves forwards, this vehicle moves forwards, 2 metres come in. So it ends up looking like this. And the snatch block travels from there to there, and you can see there's hardly any winch line left, and that's not a huge amount of distance. So we had to start the load cell as close to the snatch block as possible. Now, the way I did that was just run the winch line out, put the load cell there, then use a winch extension rope across the snatch block and down. Now, winch extension ropes don't go onto a drum, so you've got to vary their length, and I did that using an X-Locks, which you'll see in the videos, round there, shorten it, and it worked. So here's how the load cells work. That's the cell itself, and it's connected by two 12-ton shackles to whatever load you want to put in it. I've only put one 12-ton shackle in there at the moment. Now the load is measured and that is sent by Bluetooth to an app on a phone such as this. You can see it's reading 0 kilograms at the moment. And if I was to pull that, you can see that we're actually generating some force there, only just a little bit. Now that's logging every second, and what I can then do is actually generate it into a report. So here's a report I created earlier on. So we go here. Here's an example of some of the previous load testing done, so we just go into this one, and you can see there that that's a timestamp of the exact time, 0 kilograms, and you can see the load sort of building up there as well. Then what I do is I export that into Excel. Then I can analyze the data, build graphs from it, create averages, do formula calculations, etc. And that's how the load cell testing is done. Before I did any tests, I wanted to calibrate the cells. Now, they were already calibrated at the factory, then they were shipped over from the UK to the Australian distributor, and they checked and calibrated them again, and then they gave them to me, and that's the test certificate there I've got two of them, one for each one. But I wanted to do my own as well, and this is what it looked like. So I took the cells and I connected them in sequence to a tree, and then just pulled on them and made sure that they basically read the same. So you can see there that's the first cell, went up to about 3,300 kilograms pull there, and then that's the second cell, and then there's a very close overlap there. Now it's interesting that to some extent it's actually slightly time offset. That's because obviously the cell nearest the vehicle took up the load first, then fraction afterwards the second one. What that does tell me though is that you're just got to be wary of that, and it's only per second, it's not per tenth of a second or something like that. But nevertheless, I think this shows that the two cells read identically, so therefore the results are valid. So we've got 9 units on test, and representing the snatch rings, they are the Saber, Factor 55, Drifta, George 4x4, CampBoss, red Winches, and from the snatch blocks we've got this red Ryder, which I bought especially for the test, an ARB one which I've owned for many years, and this one here, and I forget even who made this one, but it's even older, and I've actually gone and deliberately left it out in the rain so it just gets as rusty and as inefficient as possible. So we got one load cell on the anchor, one load cell on the winch line, and both of those run all the way back to the test vehicle, which has got a shortened winch line extension attached to it, and there is in action. Now for this test we just left the patrol in drive, but we didn't give it any extra revs, so the winch is doing the bulk of the work. Here's our data logging setup. As you can see, we're well out of the way of any potential problems with the winch rope snapping. Now in these shots of the various pulleys you can see that the load varies, and that's as the car goes up a hard bit, a more difficult bit, etc. And that's just normal for full drive winching. So I wanted to just replicate that and just see what sort of results came out. Now one problem I had with throughout the testing was that sometimes a rig would be made and then the load cell would drag on the ground, and that was okay initially, but it needed to get off the ground and stay there so that the drag of the load cell didn't have an effect, because that was obviously another variable it didn't want in the equation. So it took a bit of rigging to get that out of the way. So here's the first results. I'm not going to run through every single combination of snatch block and snatch ring. I'm going to summarise that at the end, but I'm going to show you the results of each test using the ARB snatch block, which is representative. So this blue line here represents the total load on the anchor, and the green one represents exactly half of that, or a perfect 2-to-1 mechanical advantage pull. The orange line represents the actual force on the winch line, and you can see it tracks very closely indeed, and the difference between the green and the orange is the friction or the efficiency. Now you also notice on this it's really quite jagged, and that's kind of the reality of four-wheel drive winching. It's not a smooth operation when you start to look at the loads there. Many different reasons for that. Obviously the terrain itself makes a big difference. Even just a small little pebble half the size of my fist can actually increase or decrease the load. You've got ruts, you've got whether the steering was turned, you've got different levels of voltage amps going to the winch rope going on the drum. Lots of factors make a change to the load, and that's what you see here. It's not a particularly consistent load. Nevertheless, these purple areas here, I was able to analyse those. This is where the winch was rested there, and have a closer look at that, and that allowed me to start to generate some numbers to figure out the efficiency. So for the next test I selected an easier, simpler hill, a bit shorter as you can see here. Still enough that the Ranger lost traction trying to get up it, so it's still a reasonable test. And I winched this one with the car in neutral, not driving it at all. So the pull for the second test, anchor point, tree trunk protector, going over those logs, and I'll explain why they're there in a moment. There's the load cell for the measuring the anchor force, and there's all the cells and all of the rings and everything on test. There's the second load cell measuring the winch load, and then that runs back to the vehicle, and you can see there on the left I've shortened the winch extension rope to suit. Now those logs are there to lift the whole rope and extension off the ground, because I don't want it dragging on the ground, because that will throw the load cell results off. And to be honest, it's pretty good practice anyway. You can see there that the ropes are pretty close to the ground, and I don't want them rubbing on the ground. That's why I've arranged those logs to lift them up. And you can see that the load cell is now nicely into the air as the load is recorded. So I put a few clips here of snatch rings and pulleys going from no load to full load, and you can see that there's a fairly significant stretch on it, which is just basically the inbuilt elasticity in the system, of which there's always some. And also the rope never really pops out of the snatch rings either, which is fine. What I have been careful to do is take the slack out of the system before I start pulling it in, and also you'll notice that there's a small pause before I put full sort of force on it, and that's because that's always good practice, just to check whenever you're doing any form of winching that once you've got a little bit of tension in the system, it's all good, then you can go for full tension. And here's what a shackle looks like, and the rope direction is set so it doesn't undo the pen. Not recommended, I just was interested to see what efficiency it would be. Alright, the second test, same thing again. You can see that's the total anchor load there, and then that's exactly half of that. That's our perfect 2-to-1 mechanical advantage pull, and the orange is the load and winch load, and then the purple is when I was winching, resting the winch, winching again, resting it, and that was the lowering down. So I took those areas there as a nice consistent increase and decrease of load. So for test 3, this is on the flat. There's the anchor point, there's the load cell measuring the anchor force, there's a test unit which is not got the slack taken out of it yet. That load cell is measuring the winch force, and then we go all the way over to my car, and I've taken all the winch line off it so that I stress my winch the least, and I've shortened the winch extension rope with this X-Locks, as you can see there it is in all its glory. So that is connected to the vehicle, and all I'm doing there, as you can see, it's basically just locking the brakes and putting it in, and that's what it looks like. You can see the load starting to build up there, and you can get over 2 tons of load pretty easily that way. So for this test, what I did was just lock the brakes and pull the car. That generated a force of about 2 tons, and I winched for about 38 seconds, which gave me a solid 30-second run of just pure load, and I could use that to compare efficiency. So this is what a snatch ring looks like when you're putting some load on it. You can see it's gone from just complete slack to load on it. Brake hasn't fallen out, it's really been fine. So here's the George 4x4 ring, which has got the shallowest flange, and arguably that's the one which would have most risk of the rope coming out of the sheave, but as you can see, it works just fine. So this is why it's always a good reason to have lots of shackles and connector type things. I don't want to put the soft shackle around that really sharp edge on the metal snatch block, so I've used that 4.75 ton shackle instead. But that metal shackle won't go around a big 12 ton shackle on the load cell, so I've used a soft shackle to connect the two. Okay, third test now, and again that's the total anchor load, that's the perfect half load, and that there is the representative load of a of the winch load, and that's the area which I took as a example for calculating the efficiency purposes. So what I've done here is I've summarised all of the results of the blocks and the rings in one go, and that is across all 3 tests plus a couple more which I haven't detailed before I started doing those 3 main ones. So the first one here, that represents the perfect solution, a 2-to-1 mechanical advantage, which you'll never get, but the idea is to get as close to that as you can. Now the most efficient was, amazingly enough, the crap block, which I just left out in the rain and I've owned for over 20 years. A surprise, but there you go, it just did consistently edge ahead. The next most efficient, very close, was the ARB. Again, I've owned that, used that for quite a period of time, but not given it really any special maintenance. And then the first of the rings came through, and the George ring was actually the most efficient. Bit of a drop from the 2 blocks, but yeah, still quite up there. And I've put the rings in blue and the blocks in yellow. Then the ridge was actually less efficient, and the ridge consistently was behind the other 2 blocks. So I don't know if it's particularly representative, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I did just buy it off the shelf for this test, and so I'm glad to have it in there. Then the rest of the rings started to come through, and you can see that they're all pretty much there or thereabouts, and the shackle itself actually quite a long way off compared to the rest. Now the interesting thing here is if I put this red line up, that is actually the best and the worst. There's not a massive difference between the very best performing and the very worst performing, and the numbers are down here, so you can see that I've just actually rounded it to 1 decimal place, which is why they look identical, but I think with the equipment I had, 1 decimal place is going to be fine. I don't think there's any point going to 3 or 4. So you're looking about sort of 1.8, 1.9 for the blocks, and the rings you're looking at sort of 1.7, 1.8, and the shackle's right down there at 1.5. Basically what this says is that everything can do the job of being a pulley in a mechanical advantage situation when you are winching, with the exception of the shackle, which is too high friction, but even in that's not completely off the table. However, I do want to stress that having high efficiency is not quite the same as having a minimal wear and tear effect on your equipment. And you know, the soft shackle will get worn a bit by the ring over time. That's not really going to happen so much with a snatch block, and I do think that the rings treat their soft shackles and their ropes differently regardless of efficiency. So here's our average mechanical advantage. What I've done in this one is I have again said that's perfect, 2-to-1, and I've taken the results of all the blocks and all the put them together as one, and all the rings and put them together as one. So that's the average average result of the blocks, and that's the average result of the rings, and there's the shackle. And you can see there that the average result for the blocks is 4.5%, and average mechanical advantage 1.83. The ridge one sort of dropped that down a bit. And for the rings it's 7.5%, average mechanical advantage 1.74, and the shackles 18% mechanical advantage of a bit under 1.5. So if you're doing calculations out in the field, the figures I would use, I would work with a snatch block of a 5% efficiency loss, or increase depending which way you're going to look at it, and for a ring I'd go for 10%. I think those numbers are easy to work with for mental math, certainly for me anyway, and I think that they also give you a fairly nice margin of error without being overly cautious or completely unrealistic. So to put this in perspective, what I've done here is I plotted on this red line a force going from 500 up to 5,000 kilograms. We'll call that the stuck force. Now this green line is exactly half of that, and that represents how much force you would need in a perfect 2-to-1 mechanical advantage where you are putting in half the force but it's going to take you twice the time. This yellow line represents how much extra force you'd need with the block, and you can see it's really not that much at all in the grand scheme of things, and the blue line represents the extra force again with a ring. So what that is saying, that yes, blocks are more efficient than rings, but not so much that it's going to stop you using a ring. And here's the numbers to go with that. You can see that with 1,000 kilos, ideally you'd want a 500 kilogram force, that's zero friction. With a block you're looking at more like 523 kilograms, a ring 537. We go down to let's say a 3,000 kilogram pull. Now that is a lot of force to an average four-wheel drive weighing 3 or 4 tons. You'd rarely be winching with that amount. But that would be 1,500 kilos perfect, but 1,568 with a block. So you're losing 68 kilograms, or rather having to add an extra 68 kilograms worth of force effort there, 1611 with the ring. So again, that's not going to make the difference between you getting out or not getting out. And if it does, if you've got a snatch ring, they're so cheap and light and easy, rig yourself a triple line pulley. If you're not sure how to do that, have a look at my other videos. So I had a look around to see who else has done this sort of testing, and I found this study by the Bushwalkers Wilderness Rescue Squad, and it's a PDF, fairly detailed, and here's what they've done. They've got an anchor and they've got a load, 80 kilograms, which represents a presumably injured bushwalker, and then they're going to raise that using a pulley. They're going to measure the efficiency of that pulley, which is basically pretty much exactly what I'm doing, just on a larger scale, much greater than 80 kilograms. Now, here's what they do. It's 80 kilogram load, and they raised it at 5 meters per minute, which I've calculated to be 8 centimeters per second. And here's what they tested: all of these different blocks and pulleys, and I've categorized them as pulleys with a bearing, which is similar to our snatch blocks, and then a non-bearing pulley. It's a carabiner with a kind of a sheave around it, which is kind of analogous to our soft shackle and rings. And then they just use a plain old carabiner, which is equivalent to my shackle test. So those are the 3 types which I've taken out of that lot there. Now the results were, they found this to be a 1.8 to 1 MA, that to be 1.7 and 1.5, and I've calculated that by going through their results and just averaging the whole lot there. So basically what they found is that the non-bearing ones, these, are sort of twice or half as efficient as the ones with bearings, and then the pulley is about 1/3 as efficient again. So that's pretty similar to what I found. What I did notice is that I found the blocks to be more efficient than theirs, and I think that's because the more load you put on it, you almost kind of get an economy of scale. If you imagine that you had a load of 5 grams either side, well, you might need to go to 10 or 15 grams to move anything, but once it's moving, then you actually get quite a good load. So I think that's probably where it comes from. But the sort of percentages they're getting relative to these 3, I think are pretty consistent with what I found. This test isn't directly relevant to four-wheel driving, but I thought it'd be pretty interesting anyway. So I've got the ARB block, and I've got the Factor 55 ring, and I've done this for all of them, and I've just hung identical weights off either side, 5 kilos, 5 kilos, 5 kilos, 5 kilos, and then I've got a bucket here at either end, and then I'm just going to take this water jug and fill these buckets until such point there's a counterbalance here, and then the rope starts to move down. So let's see what happens. So that's an interesting difference between the two. With the blocks, what we find is that once it reaches that tipping point, it sort of goes bang, and it very quickly sort of moves down as nothing, and then all of a sudden it will balance. Whereas with the rings, and factor 55 is representative here, there isn't that immediacy. What happens is that it will start to move down. It will start to move down very, very slowly, and it won't really speed up. So here's the results of the water test, and interestingly the most efficient was the George, which only required about 1.1 kilograms of water before it started to move, and then the Drifta, then the Saber, the Red, and what you notice here is that these are all the snatch rings, and they seem to be outperforming the blocks in this case, which is really quite interesting. And then again the old crap block just came steaming through there, then the ARB and the CampBoss, and then the Ridge, and then the factor 55 was the least. Now obviously this is not a particularly relevant four-wheel drive test because it's only 10 kilograms of weight. I'm really including it here because I thought it was interesting to do, so hopefully you find it interesting as well. And I also find it interesting the way that those two moved, and that the snatch blocks moved very slowly first, whereas the blocks just sort of went straight down. Alright, so a few conclusions to work through at the end of this. The first one is that rings are half as efficient as blocks or thereabouts, which sounds terrible, but to be honest the difference is so small that in practice it really doesn't make that much of a difference, and rings have advantages. They're a lot cheaper, lighter, and less bulky, so I think that they really are a good way to go for using pulleys when you're winch rigging. Efficiency is not the same as soft shackle, where I think that you might be able to have a fairly efficient ring, yet it has a relatively large effect on soft shackle. Again, it's based on the testing that I've done there. Probably need to explore this a little bit more in further detail. And the rings do wear the soft shackles, but that doesn't seem to be a problem for recreational stuff. We just don't do enough heavy duty winching for that to be a problem there. And finally, the reported issue of rope falling out of the rings hasn't really happened. I think if you just take your usual care when you're doing winch rigging and make sure everything's tight before you start to pull it in, and then do a final check after you put a little bit of tension in before you start really starting to apply that load, you're going to be fine. So you can never do enough testing, and I still have questions, I'm sure you do. Drop them in the comments and we'll see what I can do to answer them. But I've got things like, does the soft shackle make a difference? I kind of feel not, because based on the testing so far, I've used the different ones there, didn't really see a massive difference between the shackles, but I haven't tested it specifically. Does it change over time? Well, definitely the soft shackle changes over time, but I don't think the efficiency changes, because the early tests I did, even before the 3 that I showed, and I did more before that as kind of tests, that hasn't really changed the results over time. Does the diameter of the rope, 8, 10, 12 mil make a difference? It would do, but I don't think I've got the equipment sensitive enough to really measure it. Triple line pull, this is something I'm going to look at there. I'm interested to see the efficiency of using 2 or more pulleys as opposed to just 1, and also the effect of mud, dirt and wet. I'm going to find some good Lurderderg mud probably and immerse them in mud and see what difference that makes. Both the efficiency is definitely going to go down for sure, but will the block be more affected by the ring? I don't know. So look, I will get into more of this later on. If you've got any views, comments, what you'd like to see, please put them in the comments. So thanks for watching. Hope you found this video useful, and I'm going to be doing a fair bit more of it, so please continue to subscribe, like, Patreon, etc. So I'll try and sort of put some science and facts and research into four-wheel driving, and rather than just sort of rely on what people have said down the ages.